And with that, I'll introduce tonight's event. We're really excited to have an important and very relevant and necessary conversation about a really fabulous new book. I'm going to introduce our two speakers and then turn it over to them. First up, Suchitra Vijayan is an essayist, lawyer, and photographer working across oral history, state violence, and visual storytelling. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, and How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? Voices of Indian Political Prisoners. Her essays, photographs, and interviews have appeared in the Washington Post, GQ, The Nation, the Boston Review, Foreign Policy, Lit Hub, Rumpus, Electric Literature. You guys get the drift. As an attorney, she worked for the United Nations War Crimes Tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before co-founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, giving Iraqi refugees legal aid. She's an award-winning photographer and the founder and executive director of the Polis Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. She teaches at NYU Gallatin and Columbia University's oral history program and lives in New York. Suchitra will be in conversation with Madhuri Sastry, publisher at Guernica magazine. She's a writer from India. Her political writing, essays, and cultural criticism have appeared in several publications, including The Nation, Slate, Bitch, Catapult, and Serious Eats. She holds master's degrees in law with a focus on human rights from the London School of Economics and from New York University. And she lives in Brooklyn. So with that, let me turn it over to our speakers. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you so much to the AAWW for hosting this conversation. I am absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with the brilliant Suchitra Vijayan, who I'm also honored to call a dear friend. This book is such a necessary and urgent platform, a microphone, essentially, for the people in India who have been targeted and censored for being critical of the Indian state or for their dissent. And I know Suchitra has always been interested in the counter-narratives, in the margins, in the people's histories. And this work continues her quest to document, essentially, communities in resistance, communities that are fighting for their liberation, and what their experience of the state is like. Their experience has always been and remains a very different sort of experience of citizenship, and it is an experience through which those communities pick apart the democratic facade of the state, which and reveal essentially something that is very cruel, authoritarian, and, you know, dare I say, even narcissistic, a narcissistic state, whose only aim is to meet its own political aims and to further the aims of those in power. Before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to begin, and I'll speak for both of us here, to express our total and complete support of and solidarity with the Palestinian people and commitment to the liberation of Palestine. Much of what we will talk about today will be very relevant to what is happening in Palestine. And so, in fact, let's begin there. So one of the key elements of your book, Suchitra, that I wanted to start off discussing is playing out in Palestine, in India, but also in the US, and that is mass censorship and silencing. And here in the US, the lengths that corporations, places of work, but universities and the media has gone to ensure that the only narrative about what is happening in Palestine today is the support for Israel, the state of Israel, to come out, is alarming. In an article for N+1, the writer Dylan Sava called this suppression, he claimed that it has never been like this before, and it's never been this bad. And in fact, speaking of media suppression, this piece in N+1 was to be published in The Guardian, and it was killed without explanation. But anyway, he speaks of how Israeli advocacy groups have gone to new forms of censorship, doxing, harassment, how the leaders of a Harvard University student group there was a college terror list that was circulated, smearing them as anti-Semitic. And even a Berkeley professor published an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, smearing his own students as anti-Semitic and encouraging employers not to hire them. So with that, I wanted to talk about sort of labeling people as anti-Semitic or terrorists. There seems to be a certain person, a boogeyman, who's created by the state. And I wanted to ask who these people are and why they are so terrifying to the state and to those in power.
I think it's really important for us to understand that when you create these boogeymen, often the narrative that we create is that these are heroes of resistance. These are people who are doing things that are brave, they're courageous, they are frontline defenders. But in reality, I think the very fact that we make them exceptional human beings takes away from the fundamental fact that many of them are simply exercising their rights of citizenship. The right to think, the right to question, the right to protest. And what you're really seeing in India, and especially in this book, is the story of how the book actually starts with the story of G.N. Sai Baba, who is a Delhi University professor. He is someone who was who's faced disabilities his entire life. He's a paraplegic. A Delhi University literature professor gets convicted for waging war against the mighty Indian state without a crime, and the only evidence is evidence of his bookshelf. The fact that a bookshelf becomes proof of sedition tells us everything that we need to know. And one thing that we see over and over again is, and the book starts with a quote from Gulag Archipelago, that sometimes it feels that we live in exceptional times, but indeed this exceptionality is not as exceptional. They have gone after thinking people throughout history, throughout our lifetime. So I think it's also important for us to ground this within this moment. What we are seeing today feels like days after 9/11, days after leading up to the war in Iraq. A lot of us then were either leaving high school or just entering university spaces. So that ghost of the last 20 years was also repeating itself. So one thing that I really want to repeat over and over again is that these are individuals who are simply exercising their rights of citizenship. And one theme that runs throughout the book is how we are criminalizing the act of citizenship, that we are eroding what it means to be a citizen. Today, we are fast being transformed into subjects who are surveilled. We are data dust, to be sold, to be created, but not citizens with complete rights. And that theme really runs throughout the book. It runs throughout the book in terms of how every category of individual, the student, the lawyer, the poet, everybody gets criminalized. And what is really alarming is that in all of these cases, there is no crime, there is no evidence, and yet all of these individuals are criminalized, in some cases convicted of sedition simply because of your bookshelf, in other cases languishing in prison for as long as 7 years in some cases without a trial, again, unilaterally designated by a state to be called a terrorist.
Could you talk a little bit about G.N. Sai Baba's bookshelf and what was found there?
I can. It's in the book. Before I do that, I just very quickly want to I want to get the list right. Before G.N. Sai Baba, there was another case, which is the case of Vinayak Sen, who was a doctor, in whose case was also, he was accused of being a Naxal sympathizer. In this case, someone who is sympathetic to the Naxal and Maoist movement. In his case also, the proof that was used was his bookshelf. So I'm just very quickly going to get to the page. So in the case of Vinayak Sen, we have 5 CDs about fake encounters that happened. We have a postcard. We have a newspaper dated 2006, a series of newspapers, a yellow colored booklet called The Unity Between the CPI. we have a Xeroxed article in English called Naxal Movement, Tribals and Women's Movement, a handwritten photocopied page of how to build an anti-US imperial front, and an 8-page article titled Globalization and the Service Sector in India. And then another document called Recent Police Activities and Its Effects. And then a book called Salvajudam, which again, Salvajudam was a paramilitary army created. So this was the bookshelf of Vinayak Sen, which happened before G.N. Sai Baba. In G.N. Sai Baba's case, it's a BBC documentary. It is a book by Arundhati Roy. It is a series of radical publications, and also a photograph that he had with Nugi Vatiango. So they pick up a photograph from Nugi Vatiango, is G.N. Sai Baba's favorite author, who he translated in prison. So these are all evidences of sedition that was used to convict them.
I remember that photograph, and I don't think they ever returned it to him. Oh, they never at all.
No, they didn't return it.
They never returned it. I sort of wanted to ask if you could say a little bit about in addition to just the gross disregard for evidence and manufacturing of claims, what is the other sort of, how is the state machinery empowered to suppress speech and label people as dissidents, and then they can proceed in the way that they would like?
One thing we are very clear about India in this book is that we want to be very clear that all of these erosion of rights did not happen or begin with Narendra Modi coming to power in 2014. For those of you who do not know, in 2014, a party called the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which is right-wing and nationalist, came to power under Narendra Modi. Before that, you had a very different governments, the Congress, and Congress with its various other coalitions ruled the country. They're very specific to clarify that this, what we call regimes of impunity, did not happen when Modi comes to power. It happens over a really long time. So how do they do that? One, it really starts with building a series of extrajudicial laws like the UAPA, the sedition laws, which really start entrenching impunity and a kind of emergency provisions into the law. For example, you have something called the POTA, which is very similar to the American Patriot Act, which gets, which kind of is instituted in India just weeks after the Patriot Act is implemented in the United States. While POTA itself gets repealed in India, many of its deeply Islamophobic, deeply authoritarian, unlawful, draconian provisions get re-legislated back in other criminal laws. You have the UAPA, which first comes into promulgations around 1967, but over the years, through various amendments, the law gets more and more draconian. In 2019, what really happens is that the amendment that Modi government does is it now unilaterally designates people as terrorists. So the burden of proof is reversed. Another thing that happens is something called the sunset clause, which means that before, every 2 years, you have to go back to the parliament and say, to get these kind of very exceptional emergency laws okayed. Now that you've done away with these emergency laws, you have for all purposes entrenched emergency provisions into everyday legislature. So that is what's happened with the law. In addition to that, you have a series of new national security institutions that were put into place. The 2008 bomb blast in India gives birth to the National Investigative Agency, which again is invested with so much resources that we do not know how much money the government of India. It's unaccountable, unfettered power. Along with it, you have the stacking of ideological foot soldiers. You have institutions like the judiciary, the police, of course, the media, all complicit in becoming a unified voice of a state that is afraid of all kinds of dissent. I also want to be very clear and say that it's not just the BJP. I think we have to be critical of all kinds of state power. For instance, the states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala on the south are often called the bulwark against the fascist onslaught. These states also employ these exact same laws to criminalize dissent in their own individual states. For instance, in Kerala, you have a series of journalists being arrested for reporting on Adani. In Tamil Nadu again, which is considered to be very progressive, you don't have to agree with the journalist, but you cannot target a journalist for their opinion. So what you're really seeing is an absolute erosion of institutions, along with ideological foot soldiers. You have regimes of impunity that create laws that entrench agency, and of course the media that kind of parrots. That's the larger version, but as we narrow in on different cases, you see a certain kind of pattern emerging.
Right. So I think you refer to this as the creation of a sort of false sense of constant emergency in the book, that we are always under attack. And so these laws that generally are able to be enacted during times of mass hysteria are capable of being enacted at any time, essentially, with people's support.
I mean, mass hysteria is the reality. It's no longer an exception. It's no longer dystopian. I think what you're really seeing is constant disinformation, an infrastructure that can produce and incite hate. There is lack of trust. And so it's a mass hysteria all the time. You're constantly responding to something. You're constantly responding to disinformation. You're constantly creating the other. So that process is just ongoing, and it just keeps the cycle of repetition, the cycle of violence just keeps increasing. The cycle becomes shorter and shorter.
I wanted to sort of pick up on something you had said in your last response. I love that turn of phrase that you used, institutions becoming foot soldiers of fascism. And I would really like for you to speak about the judiciary and how the judiciary has been turned into this sort of, from a watchdog to essentially a foot soldier of fascism.
I think I can go on for the entire, but let's see what India's called the world's largest democracy. And Indian Supreme Court is often held at an incredibly, it's respected, it's venerated, but let's kind of look at the history in the last few years. In 2016, something called the demonetization happened. That petition has still not been heard, and it's still waiting. The revocation of Article 370 happened in 2019. That has still not been heard. There is just so many important cases that deal with the everyday dignity and freedom and safety of citizens, all of which has not been heard. I think this was last year. This was last year. This is so much happening, and I have to remember I'm into 2023 and not 2021. In 2022, a petition was filed in the Supreme Court of India, which clearly said that Christian communities are increasingly facing a very particular kind of attack and hate, organized, systematic. When the petition is put before the Supreme Court, guess what the Supreme Court of India said? It can wait till the heavens fall. So here are organizations that have spent years, if not at least with this most recent round of attack, documenting meticulously what's happening to the minority Christian community in India. The petition was filed with great care. And yet, the country's highest court simply says, it can wait will the heavens fall. There are other instances in the book. I also kind of want to step away from the Supreme Court and also look at the lower courts in the judiciary. For instance, in the case of Jain Sai Baba and in the case of Vinayak Sen, what you really see is that in both these cases, there was no crime and there was no evidence. Ideally, a lower court would have dismissed these cases, but they didn't. In Jain Sai Baba's case, it was Jain Sai Baba and others. And the only other evidence, in addition to the bookshelf, was evidence procured by torture. Law of evidence in India is very clear that any evidence procured by torture is not admissible. It doesn't require, there's a law, there is jurisprudence, there is precedent. So any judge at the lower courts, when presented with an affidavit from the accused saying that his confession was procured by torture, that evidence should have been disposed away. It wasn't. It was still used as evidence of guilt against G.N. Sai Baba and others who were convicted in the case. The other instance in which the judiciary really went above and beyond is the case of Zakia Jafri, who is the wife who was fighting for the Gujarat case. In this case, the judiciary not only accused Ms. Jafri of stirring the pot, but also used that moment to target Teesta Satawat, who has been fighting for the Gujarat riot victims, which then became the basis for a hounding and arrest. It's Justice Karnalkar. And then 2 days later, Himanshu Kumar, who's another activist who files charges of a massacre that happened, was also dismissed. He was fined 5 lakhs. And the very men accused of the massacre then were put in charge of an investigation of the massacre. Recently, Sanjeev Bhatt, who has been going to court, has been sanctioned that every time he goes to court, he will be fined for filing a petition. So what you really see is not only does the judiciary not act in places where they're supposed to rule, they also subvert the existing laws of jurisprudence. Ones that they not only rule, but they also refuse to acknowledge the basic laws of evidence. As I said, I can go on and on and on, but it's a long list of judicial complicity, but also abdication of their responsibility to act.
I have a very simple follow-up question, but why are they abdicating the principles on which they're founded and their duty to uphold the rule of law, or just basically not throw out evidence obtained by torture, for example? Why?
That would assume that this is a new trend and not something that's always been foundational to. There are many ways of looking at this, but I think what you really see is judicial apathy. You also have a system in which judges post-retirement end up with certain kind of cushy positions. But again, I do not want this to be about personal ruminations about individual characters or moral integrity. But I think what is really important is that the Ambedkarite constitution, or part of the Ambedkarite constitution that was created in India, was important because for the first time it said that the state should always rule in favor of the fundamental right, which means that the courts should always rule in favor of the fundamental rights, never in favor of the state. But what you increasingly see is the courts ruling against the fundamental rights and in favor of the Indian state. So people can draw their own conclusions as to why, but how is quite telling.
So I think one of the testimonies that really stood out in the book was of a Dalit activist who says that the state has a boot on our neck, and then goes on to talk about how the noose has always been around the community's neck, and it just gets tighter and tighter, and it's only sort of becoming more visible. So to your point of how this has sort of always been the state of affairs. So even within, political prisoners or people who are dissidents, there's categories of dissidents. And I think the BK16 Alga Parishad case would demonstrate this nicely, and I would love for you to talk about it, maybe with a little brief historical overview. I'm very interested in 2 things. How the Alga Parishad, just a meeting of anti-fascist, anti-caste activists, turns into a narrative of a plan to assassinate the prime minister and waging war against the state. So how that narrative is built, and from your experience doing research for the book, how the state tends to view anti-caste activists in particular.
I think I'm just going to read and quote from one of the activists that we actually, when we were doing field work, another thing that I want to point out is that this book was co-written with Francesca Recchia, who is the editor and creative director at Polis Project, along with the immense dedication and labor of our researchers. Many of them who continue to face a lot of threat because they're based in India. The Dalit activists that we interviewed didn't want to be mentioned. Their names don't appear. Only if someone worked in the area long enough, they would know who. So I'm just going to read out some of the quotations, some of the quotes in the book. In this book, I just want to just talk to one I'm reading out the quotes. So this is a Dalit activist who's talking to us about the Bhima Koregaon violence and what happens after. She says, "The state has always had a boot on our neck. Forget living. Imagine what it takes to survive this. The boot is always pressed against minorities' necks, making it hard to breathe, demanding that they beg for dignity every day." She added, "For us, it doesn't matter who's in power. Oppression is the only thing that hasn't changed." So that again kind of is very important for us to understand that what we see as exceptional now, we are seeing artists, intellectuals, writers, people that we know getting arrested now, but for those of them within these activist circles, this has always been the case. I'm just going to continue reading another quote where we cite them again, where they say, "They've always come for us first. They've killed our people. This is what I mean. It seems unbelievable when they come for your intellectuals, writers, lawyers, and thinkers now. But what is unbelievable in your world has always been the everyday reality for us. The state always comes for us, and there is always a noose connected to us that can be tightened anytime." So when we were doing our interviews, there was a very clear divide when you talk to Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi activists on the ground, because their reality of fighting the Indian state is 75 years. On the other hand, when you talk to the civil society, which is mostly made of lawyers and others in urban areas, who perhaps have great respect and solidarity with the other communities, but are not directly in this line, their way of thinking and language is very different. So I think it's very important for us to really ground that reality that there are communities, oppressed communities in India, have always faced a certain kind of violence that I don't think any of us can begin to understand or articulate. Now, in terms of the Bhima Koregaon case, how many of you know what the Bhima Koregaon case is, and how many of you would like a background? If you would like a background, raise your hand and I will do it. Okay. So Bhima Koregaon is an incredibly potent place. The place has a long history because Bhima Koregaon is where 200 years ago, a predominantly Dalit army defeats the Maratha Peshwa, which is seen as a moment of important in terms of Dalit history, in terms of their cultural history, political history, but also in terms of popular mythology within the community for what it stands for. So every year in Bhima Koregaon, you'll find large number of Dalit communities gathering. And this is the 200th year, 2018 were 200 years of the Bhima Koregaon. 2018, around this time, you also have a conference that happens the day before the Bhima Koregaon celebrations called the Elgar Parishad. So BJP comes to power in 2018, an Elgar Parishad conference is organized, which for the first time in a very long time brings together left and anti-caste groups together. For a lot of you, you might ask, why, what is so great? Because in India, the left and the anti-caste movement really don't get along. Nobody gets along very well in India, but that's true of all activist circles. But they come together and they take two pledges. The first pledge says, we are going to work together to make sure that we find the new Peshwai, which is the new Brahminical, and we are going to challenge. So for them, they're equating the defeat of the Maratha Peshwai 200 years ago to the current Peshwai. They say that we are going to defeat this new Brahminical empire and we will not vote for people. This is a grand success. There is a lot of It's elect from people who were there at the event. It's an electrifying moment. People come together. The very next day, some of the participants of the Elgar Parishad conference make their way to Bhima Koregaon. In Bhima Koregaon, what you really see is unfettered right-wing violence unleashed upon those gathering. Immediately, police reports are filed. And again, what's important is that when the Bhima Koregaon violence was happening, in social media, you see some of the most horrible images of violence play out. The blood, the gore. Now, when you go back, I think 80% of those images are now gone. You can't find them anymore. Anyways, so this violence happens. And immediately you have first-hand accounts that this was violence that was prepared for by right-wing groups. The first FIRs are filed against right-wing groups. But very quickly, a second FIR is filed, which accuses the very communities that were affected by the violence as the perpetrators of violence. And quickly, without evidence, they claim that Elgar Parishad and the Bhima Koregaon violence were orchestrated by the same people who not only want to wage a war against the Indian state, but also want to kill the Prime Minister. Based on that, through a series of arrests, what you have are the BK-16, 16 people arrested over the course of 2 years in staggered manner. Some of India's most thoughtful writers, scholars, frontline defenders, all arrested without proof, based on a second FIR. Some of them are now out on bail, others continue to languish. And you see the same thing with the Delhi violence, where the communities that face violence are quickly portrayed as the perpetrators, and those responsible for the violence and hate crime walk free, and the state starts building manufactured evidence, or sometimes there is no evidence. That's what UAPA does, is that you can arrest someone without evidence. That's why designating someone unilaterally becomes important. And you really start the process as a punishment. People can stay in prison for years. The youngest in the BK-16 is Mahesh Raut, who spent, I think, his 4th year in prison. The oldest is the Jesuit priest, Father Stan Swami, who actually died in custody 2 years ago, who was suffering from Parkinson's because the state refused to give him medical care. That's just the.
Thank you.
That's just the cliff notes.
That was a really wonderful.
And there's also Israeli surveillance involved, yes, because then NSO Pegasus was used to surveil all of them. It was used to plan incriminating evidence. It was used as a way to target not only the BK-16, but the others, all of which is, of course, tested on Palestinians. And Anthony Lowenstein has an incredible book called The Palestine Laboratory, where he talks about he actually interviewed people from BK-16 and their lawyers to talk about how Israeli technology is actually used to surveil activists, not only in India, but around the world.
And their bulldozing of homes and taking people's land is also co-opted by the Indian state in the bulldozing of Muslim activists' homes. I really don't go into Kashmir in your book, but it's just another example. But I wondered if you could talk about this authoritarian regime sort of propping one another up and the bulldozing of the state really entering the home and then demolishing it.
In the book, the first time, so the state enters your home twice in the book. The first time, I think for many of you encountered, or many of you may be familiar with the student activist Afreen Fatima. Her home was bulldozed last year. Afreen was a brilliant leader, a scholar, but she's also a researcher on this book who was helping us put this book together. So initially, when we were putting this book together, this was only supposed to be a collection of prison writings. And Afreen was really the glue that was in India, who was working with us, reaching out to political prisoners, their families. And when Afreen's home was bulldozed and her father was picked up, when her home was again illegally, without due process, bulldozed, 90% of the material for the book was also destroyed with the bulldozing of her home. And for us as a community and a collective of people who work on documenting state violence, you realize that the difference between writing about state violence and when state really enters your home is very different. And at that point, the book really changed. We went back. Afreen continued to work on this book. I don't want to talk about Afreen because it's really not my place to talk about Afreen. If any of you would like to learn more, Afreen wrote an incredibly brave essay for the Time magazine about the bulldozing of a house, where she again doesn't center herself, but centers what happens to the community, because it's very important for us not to talk about ourselves or one, but actually talk about what's happening in terms of broader patterns. And the second time the state enters the home is when we speak to Sabah Hussain, who is Gautam Navlakha's partner, one of the BK-16 prisoners who's arrested. Sabah again says something very similar. She says, Sabah and both Gautam have long, respectful, histories of working on state violence in Kashmir and other places. And then Sabah says, yeah, when the moment state enters your house, it's just very different. So there is a difference between thinking and writing about state violence, and then finally, when the state does enter your home, I don't think one really can articulate what that means. In terms of the larger patterns, what you're really seeing in India is bulldozing of Muslim homes, properties have been happening for a really long time. A lot of what's happening here is also perfected in Kashmir. And one of the reasons we also don't include Kashmir and the Northeastern India is because they require a very different analysis. And we're very cognizant of not putting what's happening in Kashmir in the same equation with India. And what we're really trying to do is understand a pattern of state violence. And the pattern that we're beginning to see is an emergence of a kind of an apartheid state, where you see communities, especially minority communities. In the case of Muslims, you see bulldozing of houses. In the case of Dalit bastis, you see indiscriminate arrests. With Christian communities, you see a different kind of violence. But what you're really seeing is a state-abetted violence on anyone that they think is a minority. And that is quickly kind of spreading throughout. And I'm happy to talk more about it, but that is kind of happening.
I'm just going to wrap up before we open up to Q&A with one last question. You mentioned how the experience is completely different when the state actually enters your home. And I wanted to ask you about what you learned about what it means for people and people's homes, members of the community, to be so violently taken away from their community. And whether you feel there is any chance of building global solidarities, because it feels like that used to be such a cornerstone of leftist philosophy and is slowly sort of vanishing. So yeah, what does it mean essentially to have such violence inflicted on your people? And what chance do we have at global solidarity?
So one thing we wanted to do, and one thing that is also philosophy that we follow when thinking about state violence, is that you can never talk about an individual. You can only talk about the community. When you take someone violently away and you write about them, we often write about the moment of violence. We talk about this happened to this person. Even in Afreen's case or others' cases, Afreen's house was bulldozed, Afreen's father was taken away. But that is just the beginning. There is violence that precedes it, and there's violence that follows. The fact that someone is being rendered homeless, the fact that when you take away someone from a community, it's an entire community that is left without that person. Everybody in the book talks about just the simple visits to the police station. The idea of keeping hope, the idea that there's a community that you're leaving behind that is bereft, that then has to organize itself and continue to fight. So one of the things that we really do in this book is to really place every individual that we write about within the larger context of who they are, what they're fighting for, and there's a history. These are not just individuals that are taken away. These are individuals who are taken away for a reason. Many of them are organizing in communities like Gadchiroli. They are organizing in Adivasi communities. There are many Dalit activists who are very much embedded within their communities. When the Bhima Koregaon violence happened, one of the other things that happened was a series of counterinsurgency style cordon searches in Dalit bastis across Maharashtra, where we still don't know how many young Dalit boys were picked up. Because the activists were taken away, we don't know their numbers, right? So this is not just a person being incarcerated. We have to ask questions of why they were incarcerated, on what grounds, and what happens once they're taken away. Mahesh Rawat, for instance, was actually working on organizing communities against the occupation of their land, appropriating Adivasi land, fighting against it, the consistent massacres and violence that happens, documenting it. Those reports are powerful testimony of what the state does. So we have to ask why they're being taken away. And I think that really gives you a sense of what happens and how communities resist. And it's very important for us, both me and Francesca, when we wrote this book, is to not make martyrs or heroes out of these people, because they are martyrs and heroes, but they're also individuals who are simply exercising their right to live with freedom and dignity. What can we do in terms of global solidarity is, I think it's also the failure of the left. I think as a left, we don't, first, I don't know if there is an actual left in the United States anymore. What is considered left is a broad spectrum of liberal to, I think sometimes introspection is so important that we stand, one, I think we have lost our capacity to listen to each other. The left itself has so many dissenting voices, we don't agree with, and that's fine. That is what it's supposed to be, but I think we really need to go back to what it means to organizing. And I'll just end with an anecdote that I heard from my grandfather when I was 14. My grandfather was part of the Communist Party of India before India became independent. And one of the stories I remember, and I remember very vividly, is him saying that every time these young men would go to these villages to organize, they would reach around 7 o'clock in the night. It would be dark. If one person turns up, they would still do the entire speech and convince them that why should you resist? What should you fight for? This land is yours. You've been working on this land. Why do you have the right to this land? The idea that you engage with everyone with dignity is something I think the left has to relearn. And global solidarities are so important. We march for each other. And the great words of Angela Davis, we have to fight for freedom globally. Freedom doesn't happen individually. And I think this room is also a testament to the fact that you start with Palestine because there are resonances. You think what's happening in Palestine is also what's happening in Hawaii. What's happening in Hawaii is what's happening in Sudan. We've forgotten Sudan. Sudan right now has the highest number of displaced people. That is no longer in the news. We've forgotten about Tigray. We've forgotten about Afghans who are waiting. We really are in this age where we keep forgetting that solidarities have to be built long term. And hopefully we will, and we'll continue recognizing where we fall short and then use that as the basis for building a better place. If not better, at least something to leave behind.
Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation. And we will now open it up to Q&A. Are there any audience questions? Yes, please.
Should pass around the mic or just thank you so much. One there, two there, and then
thank you very much for this engaging talk. One thing that you have been describing that I see as a person who has written against Guantanamo in this country and state violence is that there's a concept I'm sure you're familiar with in social sciences, particularly in anthropology, called lawfare, which is when the government passes laws, in a sense, to create these regimes of impunity that then narrow the space for people to then stand up and protest. So freedom of speech or freedom of expression then starts to diminish. The state then is able to enact the various regimes of violence from the criminal justice system, and the very rights that citizens are afforded to express themselves because they're diminished then start to become endangering. As an attorney, what are the kinds of remedies you envision in this kind of moment of lawfare globally, whether it's the United States, whether it's what we see in Israel and Palestine, whether it's in the Indian government, when just the very act of speaking endangers people?
Neil, thank you so much, and also thank you for the work you do. There's a reason why I'm no longer a lawyer. There's a reason that I don't believe that, I do not believe that law is a solution for the problems. We cannot, in my opinion, we cannot keep petitioning the very structures and systems that incarcerate our people, the very systems that narrow what it means to fight, the same system that polices our language, right? Like, a lot of us came of age in the years after 9/11 where we were considered too violent. I'm sure many of us here of a certain age will remember this argument when somebody would, I at least know 2 people in this audience who've heard this. Oh, when you're angry, people only listen to your anger and not your argument. The very fact that we are not, so all of this is policing. So I do not believe that law is a solution. I remember there is this, when the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial was happening here. I was in the archives last year, and there's one photograph of Bobby Seale being gagged. There is this, I think this artist, I think his name is Met Mohan. He would do these quote illustrations, and there's this one image of where he's sketching Bobby Seale being gagged. You know, you can see Bobby Seale's profile, and you can see him gagged in his mouth. I do not expect these systems to give us justice. I do believe, and increasingly I believe that organized, unified civil disobedience, the fact that we march to push for change, we keep advocating, is what it is. That doesn't mean that the lawyers who work bravely for Guantanamo stop working. No, it's only because you have those people working that people like Madhuri Sastry and others are now out from Guantanamo. But that is a strategy, not a roadmap for resistance. For me, the roadmap of resistance is all of us working together, civil disobedience, standing for what is, and also paying the price. I'm sure we've all paid prices for the positions we've taken. So short answer, no, I don't think law is going to save us. And the Supreme Court of India is not going to save us either, or the Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you so much. Suchitra, thank you so much for the book, but also for your insistence on talking about the larger patterns and not isolated incidents, and your insistence that ordinary citizens are neither criminalized or turned into extraordinary criminals, nor into extraordinary heroes. I wanted to ask about these larger patterns, because you just spoke about very passionately about how rule of law is used to undermine justice. But this is a pattern across the world, right? Where rule of law is being used to undermine justice. India joins a slew of countries across the world as an illiberal democracy, a slew of countries across the world where autocrats are elected through democratic, reasonably free democratic processes, where the means of perpetuating these illiberal democracies, which is criminalizing civil society, capturing a free media, undermining judiciary, etc., is supported and finds public, popular approval. Now, I just wanted to ask therefore, what kind of conversation do you want this book to generate, given your very thoughtful insistence on talking about patterns? And number two, what is the expectation of the citizenry or citizenship defenders whose testimonials you use in the book? What is their expectation in terms of the conversation that can emanate from this book, given that, while they are not on the margins, and there are many that are like them, nonetheless, the popular discourse does not support their points of view.
There's something that my dad says. My dad always says, you should know the measure. Everyone has a measure. You should know, which basically means that we all should know what our limitations are. I know my limitations of who I am. And I think the reason this book exists is an act of memory. And I think it's very important. And I'm going to not use my words, but I'm going to use the words of Siddhi Kappan. Siddhi Kappan is a journalist who was traveling to Hathras to document the gruesome rape and murder of a young Dalit girl. And he was picked up and he spent over 800 days in prison. Again, under the UAPA terror laws. When Kappan comes out, the first public talk that he gives, he says, the only resistance to fascism is memory. Let's not forget. And one of the reasons that we wrote this book was really to not forget, because so much was happening so quickly. And as writers, we were responding to a political moment. This political moment required and requires that we all remember and write. And that's how the book is structured. The book starts with a timeline. So every day you know what happened. So it's in this last 2 weeks, you've seen the raids. 800 homes raided simultaneously in India over a New York Times article that claims Chinese funding, a NewsClick editor being picked up. You're seeing targeted violence against other human rights. The other news that didn't get so much traction was Human Rights Forum members in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana being grounded. So what you're really seeing is something happening every single day that it becomes difficult for us to remember. Other thing that we did in this book is that the book has a list of 250 people. It's an incomplete list, it's an ongoing list. And as we expand this book for the India edition, the list will go. We have 250 names of people incarcerated since Modi comes to power. It has their names, the number of days in prison, under what laws they've been picked up, are they still in prison, they are not. It's a list. And that list should exist because we know. So this book is really an act of memory, just documenting, consolidating. As I said, so much of what happened with Bhima Koregaon violence has now disappeared. What happened during the Delhi violence is now increasingly disappeared. Important human rights reports are beginning to disappear. So we see our work as merely stenographers. This book is an act of community. We are stenographers of this moment and we are just responding. So that is what we are. That's our measure. That's all that we can do. And this book also exists because there's some remarkable journalists. A lot of the source material in this book exists because it can be cross-checked, primary source checked. And though they continue to work. So that's in terms of what we are doing, is that's what we can do. What will happen, I don't know, right? It's simply, we do this and hopefully this will become something else. Now, in terms of what the people in the book who are here, what they want is they do what they're doing, which is every single one of them who has managed to come out, say they will continue doing this. Right? They're like, you've already incarcerated us. You've taken everything away from us. You think this is going to stop us? No. Every single one of them, when they step out of prison, stepped out smiling. They're reading, they're writing, they're making plans to write edited volumes. They're prison writings. Sudha Bharadwaj already has a prison writing. Why? Because they are documenting, they want to do it. And they will continue doing it because that is what they know to do. Questioning the state, being helpful, being useful. And I think we're all just doing what we're doing. And we hope that this would contribute to something else. I know there's nothing, as you said, we're not superheroes. We're not supposed to be superheroes. We should not be superheroes. Our job is to simply do our job and keep doing it with as much integrity as possible. And hopefully something will come out of it. If not, then that's also where things are. So that's where I'll leave
it. What I have to ask is building on what the last two questions were in a way, so it's a nice segue on that. The one part is that, you said law is a strategy, that, to use it as it's nice to do it, but I share your frustration and your with the Indian Supreme Court and other Supreme Courts of the world, for that matter. But if you look at mass public political participation, it's not a great success story. I mean, I lived in London many years, and Brexit happened in spite of the rallies. You had one of the biggest rallies I've ever seen was on 15 February 2003 to stop the war in Iraq, but it happened. Ian McEwan wrote a great novel, but other than that, the war still went ahead. And we've had rallies about Palestine. We've rallies also in support of the Israeli kids with Hamas, which is also a crime against humanity. That also must be recognized. But London had two successive side-by-side rallies, and the wonderful Shaheen Bagh protests in India. But ultimately then COVID happens and it gets pushed away. So is the disconnect between the elite on one hand and this chorus of approval that the loud voices on internet have, those who try to drown out other voices, whether it is on Twitter or wherever else, is it so formidable that we are in that space where the elite are just going to disregard it because courts are not going to help them, bureaucracy has been co-opted, the army is putting out messages which are supportive of the state? Are we reaching that? Because that's the kind of thing where people think of violent option, which would be terrible.
I think the two, Shaheen Bagh did one thing. I remember when the Babri Masjid death judgment happened, we were expecting protests on the street. It didn't happen. But then Shaheen Bagh happened. There was a ray of, it did something, it jolted everybody's, there was this moment of hope. And having that moment of hope is so important because hope is radical. And I do not want people to walk away feeling depleted. Some days are exhausting, but it's important. The farmers' protest again stalled. The Shaheen Bagh protest also stalled what could have been a rapid expansion of NRC. It showed us what it meant, that to a point where the tele-violence and COVID had to be unleashed to kind of deplete that movement. So yes, these are not perfect. Revolutions, the 18 Brumaire, revolutions are never successful. But that does not mean that we do not revolt. We continue to revolt because that's what you do. You fight fascism because that's what happens. And I also want to say that I lived in Cairo months before the Arab Spring. Many of my friends were organizing for years. If someone had told me in 2009 that the Arab Spring was about to happen, I would have laughed at their faces. The Arab Spring happened. Again, a failed revolution, but revolt we must. My friends didn't make it. Like, these are young people I know, we were in our 20s. Many of them didn't make it, but some did. But revolt we must. We marched for PLM, we will march for something else, we'll march today for Palestine, we will continue marching because revolt is what we do. And sometimes the results are not perfect. But as I said, revolt is what we do. And it gives us hope. I remember, I remember Kanaya Kumar and others on JNU campus, the students coming together. It was, of course, many of them from that moment might have disappointed us, but hope is important. the hope that something will better emerge in all of this is absolutely important for political imagination. If that is depleted, then we are all lost. And what else do we have? So yes, revolutions fail, people disappoint, but this larger idea of freedom, that's the most important thing. You do the work you do, Salil, because you do every day, you write, you've been doing this longer than many people I know, but you do it because it's important. And revolt we will. It will fail, but revolt we will. So I'll just leave it at that.
We are running out of time, unfortunately. But Suchitra will be doing
Book signing at the back. You can get a copy of your book here and hopefully ask any lingering questions that you may have. Thank you once again, Suchitra. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this conversation. And I also want to thank the Asian American Writers Workshop for doing an amazing job. The first time I came here, I saw Jhumpa Lahiri speak many years ago. This place has hosted and held space for so many. You continue to platform writers others might not have looked yet. So grateful for everything you do. So thank you for having us. Thanks for putting all of this together.